you all take the floor. Thank you. Green button.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We're extremely honored and excited to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. It's been a marathon for this journey, so we're going to keep it fun and exciting. My name is Maura Rockcastle. I'm principal and co-founder of 10 by 10. We're a landscape and urbanism practice in Minneapolis. And we have assembled a fantastic team. We're a group of like-minded designers and collaborators. We've all worked together before. We have a deep history of projects that we're going to walk you through. We're a balanced mix of local and non-local partners. Let me introduce my colleagues. Michael Murphy, principal, co-founder of Mass Design Group in Boston. His colleague, associate designer Jadi Williams, poet, artist. Nathan Adkisson, director of strategy from local projects in New York.
It's okay, you can't, we're good, but they'll focus up.
Liz Scrissen and Joel Schmidt of DMET, which are your neighbors, the office right across the street, architects and our local anchor on the project. Jessica Rossi Mastracci, my colleague at 10 by 10, landscape designer, and Craig Wilkins, academic, activist, architect with the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Design, lives 2 blocks away. So we're excited to share with you our initial conversations and ideas about this place and this district. There is an undeniable power dynamic at play between the museum and many of the institutions here and the site. At every step of the way, you are being asked for permission. Can I go here? Can I linger here? Should I be here? The question of hierarchy and accessibility of this space is the reason this team has been brought together. 10 by 10 is working on projects across a range of scales across the country, plazas and libraries, historic sites, the last operating steel mill in Pittsburgh, art installations, and intimate gardens. We've just begun working with David Chipperfield Architects on the master plan for MIA, which has just been rebranded, so if I say DIA, which I won't after this, blame it on Minneapolis. This site and this museum, McKim, Mead, and White designed museum with an addition by Graves, has many similar challenges to the DIA. The grand front entry has been abandoned. The landscapes are inactive and peripheral. They're underutilized. It's likewise surrounded by some fantastic assets. Children's Theater, Minneapolis College of Art and Design. It sits in a campus that isn't working. And it isn't addressing its neighborhood in the way that it could. And the neighborhood is also changing, and the museum and the institution is trying to invite the neighborhood in to engage in a different way. About a year ago, we started working with Mass Design Group on an international design competition for Gallaudet University, which is one of the nation's only deaf and hard of hearing universities. Our team included 3 artists embedded in the team, and our process involved a series of specifically designed engagements to explore deaf space. How does it feel to isolate a sense and move through a landscape? What can the hearing world learn or gain from this cultural way of being that is distinctly different than what most of us know? And how can we heighten a sensory knowledge for all through the way that we design this landscape and bring this campus out to the street? So we were looking at the entire campus in a larger master plan, and we zoomed in and looked in more detail at the edge where the campus meets 6th Street in Northwest Washington, D.C. How the campus worked with the Olmsted Design historic landscape, and how it met this new development zone as a series of opportunities for the university and met the city to allow for this bilingual exchange to exist was the key prompt of the brief. We worked through a series of sensory rooms and a network of sensory paths. We collaboratively established layers of ideas about how to bring deaf space principles to life in the landscape through materials, through furniture, through branding and lighting, through the planting, the color, and the smell of this landscape. Pull it out to the street and create a distinctly different environment. When one steps on this streetscape, they know they're in a world that is being informed by a different set of priorities, a different set of sensory cues. The sensory rooms, there were 4 of them, and each of them were informed by one of our artist collaborators. This particular room is an example of a space that we created collaboratively with those artists to celebrate the history of protest on this campus, the idea of making a space that is built around language that's not necessarily verbal, and how we communicate together in a way that is distinctly different. I'm going to pass it off to my friend Michael Murphy to talk a little bit more on one of our first collaborations and some of their work.
Thank you, Maura. Fundamental to the notion of permission is about finding our greater shared goals as a citizenship. It's not just about giving something, it's about expecting something. And from that very idea, at the core is one of our theses as an organization, that the built environment, the decisions that we make as designers, as architects, as those in the spatial disciplines, these decisions are never neutral. They either help people or they hurt people. They help our communities, they hurt our communities. And it is our collective responsibility to ensure that the decisions we make at least are hedging towards the former. Very much about that, we learned about this and came up with these ideas in a project that Maura, and before she started 10 by 10, had worked on with Mass Design Group, our first project, which was the Butara Hospital in northern Rwanda. And in this project, which was one of the first institutions built by the government of Rwanda after the 1994 genocide, when they started to invest in their public institutions, they were asking this question of permission. They were asking a question of what do we expect as a public and what do we deserve? And when we think about that, then the buildings, the architecture, the spaces we design have to both represent but also symbolize that identity of our polis, of our citizenship. And in this, that comes to asking a fundamental question: what must it do? And this comes to where we must ask ourselves what we must do here at DIA. What must the impact be? The impact, the mission, the idea of this project was very simple, that people who came here not only felt it was theirs, but they also must come out better. They must heal. It's a hospital. And when we think about that, then the decisions that we make in the building are all about driving towards that fundamental mission. The same thing here in DIA. If we can isolate collectively that fundamental mission, then we can drive our decisions forward. That affected the landscape, which Maura designed, which made her decide about certain plants, all local, and certain healing types of varietals. Can a building environment heal? It changed the way we thought about the building process. Can the building process, the way in which we build, the very decisions that we make as designers in how we construct this space also foster a sense of healing, a sense of change? In this example, we hired over 4,000 people from the various communities, and we followed a very Rwandan sense of citizenship. There's a process in Rwanda where every 4th Sunday they do what's called umuganda, which means, which brings people out into the community to do community work. They have a process called ubadehe, which means community works by the community. And these two things combined together forced us to ask questions. Every material choice that we made should invest back into the very community in which it is. These ideas about participation, about citizenship, about permission influenced our most recent project, the National Memorial to Victims of Lynching, otherwise known as the National Memorial to Peace and Justice, which opened in Montgomery, Alabama this April. And this project was, is an incredibly important national project, but asks similar questions, not just how do we make a space of reflection or representation, but how does a project change the way we act as a citizenship? How does it make us remember and force us to act? And in this case, with the broad ambition, the ambitious ambition to heal our nation from a history of historic trauma. How did we do that? Well, we designed a space so that we would feel the discomfort in this memorial. We would be forced to wrestle with the history of this injustice. We would be forced to name these victims of horrible racial violence. And then we would be forced to do something. The memorial is divided into two ideas. One is a static monument where you go and reflect and feel that discomfort, but the other piece, this participatory piece, is each of these markers can be moved and taken to the counties where these killings occurred. And that is up to us, right? That's up to the citizens of this country to make a collective decision. And here in Michigan, there is a famous lynching in St. Clair County of Albert Martin, who was lynched in 1889, and you have a marker that you can claim, and you can collectively come together and claim that and choose where in your state you want to choose that. In this condition, because there's one in Michigan, it can be in St. Clair or it can be here in Detroit. It could be on the grounds of the DIA. I'm going to just show a quick video of this experience through one of our
start with them
favorite
at eye
people,
level, and then on
Oprah
this
Winfrey.
corridor, they begin to rise. And then you get to this corridor, and this is when you begin to confront the scale of all of these lynchings.
Whoa. This is something.
Yes, yes, we wanted people to have a sense of just the scale of what this violence, what this terrorism was.
So this is over 4,000
Yeah.
that have been documented, but of course there are more.
Thousands more, thousands more.
Thousands more. Will
And-
we ever even know how many?
We will never know.
Every name has its own story.
Yes, that's right. This was a minister, Reverend T.A. Allen, who began talking to sharecroppers about their rights. And because he was doing that, the plantation owners, the landowners got together and they lynched him. And the proof they used that he was somebody worthy of lynching is that when they found his body, he had a piece of paper that talked about sharecropper rights. And the other piece of paper he had in his suit jacket was a note that said, "Every man a king." A lot of these folks were lynched because they showed too much dignity. They showed too much humanity. He just wanted to be respected as a human being, and it got him hanged.
The indomitable Brian Stevenson, of course, drove this project, but I think it gets to and with many other artists we collaborated, I want to point that out, Dana King, Hank Willis Thomas, and others, in order to get this project developed. But at the core of it was this notion of the construction of dignity. And that is, I think, a key question you should be asking yourselves about the future of the DIA campus and this Midtown district. How does it instill dignity in our collective community? That is the question we'll be asking.
And also, as it relates to collective community and participatory events that bring the community into the conversation, one of the things that we did for this project here is this soil collection. And so we had 365 jars full of soil from these sites where lynchings happened across the state of Alabama. And so that allowed the community to participate in this larger conversation of this memorial being built prior to it actually being open. And we find that to be a very creative way to actually engage the conversation and give permission for these people to participate in their own history.
I want to pass this on, thank you, Juddy, to Nathan from Local Projects. Local Projects participated and collaborated with us on this with the Legacy Museum, which is a piece of the memorial as well. So again, we are all partners and friends and collaborators in the past.
Thank you, Michael. As he said, we were working on the museum that accompanied the opening of the memorial, and we just loved everything about the philosophy and the sensibility that Mass Design brought to their work, and we were really looking for an opportunity to work together again, and so we're honored that this opportunity came up. So Local Projects is a design firm that works at the intersection of architecture and software design. And the reason we do that, the reason we exist, is it's 2018. All of us right now are experiencing architecture and software at the same time. And so it only makes sense to design with both of those in mind. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our work, but I really want to frame it in terms of how it can contribute to access and participation, which you can imagine and you can see is part of the theme of really what we want to talk about here. First, I want to talk about how access and participation can be a tool in the design process itself. It can be an output, but of course, for us, it's actually where we start. Collaboration and participation is step number one. We were part of the team that designed the September 11th Memorial and Museum in New York. And the way that process started about 10 years ago was with a very simple website, just asking people to share memories, words, audio clips, images. And we really had no idea at that point what we would get. And the volume of contributions were unbelievable. And they were these artifacts and these stories that really probably couldn't have been found any other way. This is an image that someone took while their plane was circling Manhattan on that day. And as we went through these stories, we were given the opportunity to design the arrangement of the names on the memorial. And we knew, after hearing all of these stories, that simply alphabetical arrangement or chronological wasn't really telling the whole story. That there were these social connections, and there were more of them, and they were deeper than we ever could have expected. And so what we did was build a tool. This is an algorithm for the layout of the over 2,000 names that would be arranged. And this tool and the color coding that you see is for mapping social adjacencies. The names have been scrambled for privacy. But just one example of a story that drove this idea was when we heard about this man, Victor Ramos, who worked in the 55th floor of the South Tower. And he met another man, Victor Wall. They'd never met before. The elevators were out, the stairwells were blocked, and neither of them would be able to get down, and they made an agreement that they would not leave each other's side. And so their widows requested that their names be placed next to one another on the memorial. So just incredibly powerful story that we certainly couldn't have predicted, but just by building these tools for access and sharing, the results can be something greater than we ever would have imagined. Another thing that access can do is put people in charge. We were the original experience designers for StoryCorps, which is the traveling booth of our National Oral History Archive. And since then, 10,000 stories have been collected. And we've gone on to create more conversation booths, each for a slightly different purpose, different audience, different strategy. One of these was a partnership with the Emerson Collective for their Super School project. And this is another booth that moves around the country and invites people in to talk about and discuss future solutions for American high schools. And so it's part of this national brainstorm. It's part of making the design and the redesign of our schools a national conversation. And it starts in this booth. One other even simpler story about access. Access can be very serious, as you've seen. But it also can be immediate and visceral and really just fun. And so I'm going to play a short video of a piece we did that was in Times Square a few years ago.
This giant art in the heart of New York City appears to be able to measure the pulse of love.
This thing is awesome. Wow! We're making this light up.
Touch it and it flickers. Touch it with someone you love, it flares.
It says more people, more love. Do you guys?
We feel the love.
Look at that, look at that.
Even a dog can show some love.
There you go.
That's accessibility. But this just makes me start thinking about what could a beacon and a tool of participation be that's on Woodward, that feels like the people are actually controlling it. So as people are driving up and down Woodward, they have a reason to stop and ask themselves what's going on here. The final story about access I want to talk about is its ability to create a platform. I think what we're trying to do here is create a platform that unites all of the institutions. And when we think about the collections and we think about what they have to offer, I think there's incredible resources, incredible assets to make something amazing, but what we have to do is figure out how to make those appealing to more audiences. And similar to a challenge we got from the Cleveland Museum of Art, who said, we're in Cleveland, we're not in New York or London, we don't have the traffic of those cities, we need some way to make our collection more relevant, more immediate to more people. And so this was one experience we built. This uses facial recognition technology to match you to an artwork in the collection. And again, to the point of universal accessibility and inclusion, you don't have to know anything about art, you don't have to read anything, it doesn't matter what language you speak. If you have a face, you can participate. And so those are the kind of challenges that we always pose to ourselves. Also in Cleveland, we took their entire collection and we digitized it and we created this collection wall, which is a way of taking the galleries to the people on their terms, or presenting the work in terms of circles or color or love and lust or anything that actually feels meaningful and relevant to the people. And so I'm not saying that we would digitize all of your collections, but what I would like to see is how can the content and the philosophy of each of the institutions start to permeate one another. When you're here in DIA, how can you have some ideas about what's going on in the Wright Museum? How can we feel like there are fewer barriers between the institutions? And one possible way to get very specific about that is to create a tool that unifies and unites all of the institutions. And I know Kara is here from Cooper Hewitt. We had the great joy to work on reimagining the Cooper Hewitt in the way that they presented their collection. And the key, really, to that was this pen, which is a symbolic gesture to every visitor that you are in charge here. You are active. You are participating. Permission has been granted. And as you go throughout the museum, you can collect things that inspire you, but then you can also use that to create and to share. And one of those things that you can create is wallpaper. This is the immersive wallpaper room. You can use the pen to very simply create your own wallpaper patterns and then step into them. And this has been remarkably popular, and I think when people talk about social media in terms of things that people actually want to share, media that is designed to be social, this is what they're talking about. And so I'm not sure yet what that would be for all of your institutions, but there's enough content there that I know we can find something that the people of Midtown and the people of Detroit really want to see themselves in. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to our local Detroit partners, DMET.
Hi, I'm Liz. This is my husband and partner, Joel. We're DMET Studio. We're a local architecture firm right across the street from you. We look out our window every day onto your front lawn, and we think about this place an awful lot. So I'm going to let Joel tell you a little bit.
Certainly. Thank you. Given that bulk of our work is within the Midtown area, specifically within a mile, 1.1 mile radius of our office and the project site, many of you have maybe encountered some of the work that we've been doing. These works exhibit, I think, a sort of a common response to what is a peculiar circumstance within Detroit, the time and place where we are in Detroit. A rolling back of the alterations that have occurred over many years, creating more porosity, leveraging thoughtful, well-crafted, site-specific design to activate public space, to encourage pedestrian activity, and to strengthen the public realm. In a sort of a reworking and reconnecting of the interiors to exteriors. The work has also encompassed a number of installation projects as a part of the larger de-electricity program. The first being Frontier Town in over 6 years ago. One in the middle one, a project we called Mike TV, Am I Coming In Clear, a child-friendly installation that was about both being on stage, but broadcasting yourself to a larger audience from this event. And then our last piece, when we were invited to install a work on the lawn of the DIA, a project that we call the Amazing House of Fog, Cinema Il Cinema Nebuloso. A project that was part time machine, part fun house, part cinematic device, but really awakened a sensibility, I think, along with much of the activity happening throughout Detroit, of how installations such as these temporary tactical maneuvers can enliven public space, invite a larger audience, and increase accessibility to our public and civic realm. Thank you. I forgot my own prompt. Given that we are, the body of our work is here in Midtown, we have conversations about the future and the development happening in Midtown and across Detroit on a daily basis. Most notably, I would say, since the thought of turning the DIA into a town square, our attention has turned to the future and the appearances of the appearances of our cultural district. We thought for you that we might record some of these conversations, and so you'll have to excuse our noviceness as videographers, but uploading providing a bunch of information or material to our team members. They have produced this fabulous piece interviewing 4 members of the Detroit community, and we think they reflect some of the sentiments that we're bringing to you today. Actually, one of them, Rhonda Hall, is actually in the audience, a woman I met who attends the Kresge Court Daily, a businesswoman, and you'll see her story.
I'm 67, so I know that quite a way. The homeland is Arkansas, where we come from, but we settled here in Detroit.
I was born here and pretty much built too.
When I was a child, we used to just come to play. It was such a beautiful experience. The Thinker was down by the bus stop, and we used to play on the Thinker.
I used to come by myself as a kid.
I used to spend a lot of time in the museum on Sunday morning.
My mom's here, my son's an attorney, and my daughter's an engineer, and my grandchildren are here. I used to bring her here all the time. She's 10 now. She knows every nook and cranny here. She loves to get the iPad up and to do Rivera and go through information. And people ask questions, she knows all the answers.
After the riots in '67, everything sort of turned inward. It was not encouraged to interact with people on the street, close it off. And I think that was at work here, or at play.
I need to see what you're gonna do. I really love the space. I love the grass out front. I like the unique sitting they have with the red chairs. This is really one of my favorite spaces.
I want to see more information.
That really they should be sensitive to, that there is residential area here. It's not just the cultural institutions.
Yeah.
So this is a space that many in the community do use, in Craig's words, the bold and the adventurous, but it is not a space that everybody in the city comes to or feels necessarily comfortable in. For various reasons, let's go on a journey about why that might be. When we think about granting or sort of permission denied, unfriendly sidewalks participate in that. Residual leftovers, gates and do not enter signs, buildings that don't seem like they want you, a sea of parking, car-dominated, unmaintained and failing infrastructure, a place that's turned its back on the city, a place where you need permission to enter. So rather than permission denied, as we've been talking about, access granted. We've collectively decided that a sort of mission for our approach is captured by this simple statement: reimagine a civic commons. A civic commons is a place to remember and to dream, where we reclaim our human values, where we are inspired to be a better person, where we celebrate our collective aspirations, and where we provide for ourselves and for each other. A civic commons allows for social interactions, for people to engage with art, for places for solitude. It allows connections with nature, for learning and experimenting, for cultural expression, for connections to history, spontaneous events. It's a gathering place for everybody. And the spirit of it is authentic. It is of this place. The material essence is Detroit. I'm going to pass this off to Jessica to talk through some of our more detailed observations.
All right, thanks, Maura. So over the past couple of months, we've had what I think is hundreds of conversations and exchanged even more sketches with Joel and Liz to really understand the DA grounds and all of its nuances. So we were walking around yesterday, observed all these moments that Maura just mentioned of permission denied, and just got a larger sense for all of the nuances and smaller spaces and things that we want to tackle as designers. So at a very fundamental level, our approach to increasing access and to transforming the plaza into more of a civic commons is very simple. It's removing these barriers. So how do we do this? One way we think is to look critically at the streets. So what if some were closed to traffic? What if others were reduced in size and allowed for pedestrians to cross easier, to have a larger sense of public realm? What if you could simply cross busy streets while feeling safe and not feeling like you're gonna get hit by a car or having to walk really far out of the way where you see where you wanna go? So by doing this very simple thing, we set up the potential for a larger, more active public realm. We see a lot of potentials with neighboring businesses and institutions to activate the street, whether that's through installations, seating, more planting, or anything else. You know, the ground is pretty open. We understand that this project also can't just be simply beautifying or greening the grounds. That won't quite do it. We need to look at funding and economic potentials, such as identifying areas for new developments, because nothing will happen without interest or activity or even, you know, funds at a very fundamental level. So we also observe these barriers at the district scale, particularly like on Warren Avenue and Brush Street. So we think any work in this district has the potential to expand beyond these borders and integrate greater Detroit. And we started kind of identifying some of these corridors we could see as expanding, as well as corridors within the district as kind of grounds for potential and improvement. So within Midtown, there's all of these really great institutions, I think the number was 12, that have very strong and very diverse missions. So what could this look like if we bring all of these outside and into the landscape and create areas for what we're calling programmatic mashups? So we listed 10 of the institutions here with their current programming and just started to kind of imagine what could happen when you combine diverse and distinct programming. So what would a space look like if you brought the Java and Jazz outside with science experiments into a stormwater retention area, for example? Or what if you brought dance and art education outside into a forest? So we started imagining what this could look like and telling a story of what this landscape could be. So for example, let's imagine, what if we put a forest in the middle of the parking lot that's across from the DIA? What would that look like? What would it look like if the streets were reimagined to be pedestrian first instead of vehicles first? What if we opened up entire facades and blurred the interior and the exterior of buildings? What if we created landforms for places for people to sit and play and engage with? What if we transformed entire streets into large stormwater infrastructure? What if this connected and moved beyond the district into the entire city? What if we created areas for civic participation and performance? So what would this mean if this idea of creating civic space, creating a civic commons expands to the greater Detroit? And also, why does this matter? So I'm going to hand this over to Craig to dive into it a little deeper.
When we talk about permission denied, it's easy to think about that in the sense of institutions and individuals. But I also want to bring it directly to institutions, because institutions are denied as well. Our cultural institutions and the shared values that they represent are being undermined daily. There's less time, there's less commitment, there's less money for that acquisition, for that program, for that outreach, for that hire, for that exhibit. I could go on, but you get the point. All across America, in cities large and small, our civic spaces are being attacked. They're being erased, sometimes even eradicated. Tribalism, consumerism, a pursuit of all things prurient have become values. They have become virtues, something in which one might want to aspire. That aspiration, or those aspirations, create spaces, yes, but they don't create civic spaces.
Sorry, it's 10-minute warning.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'll try to be fast. So our civic realm is shrinking, both in size and in importance. Under the weight of such pressure, cracks in our democratic institutions are showing. It's important that we heal those cracks. The turn towards a civic life as spectacle, as performance, as events, exacerbates the privatization of public space. Places where you can contemplate, places where you can have unexpected engagements, places where you can have perhaps difficult conversations, places where you can self-reflect, self-educate. They are few and far between, and the few that we have typically squeeze some sort of commercial use out of that. So it's fine if you want to be contemplative, it's fine if you want to make connections, but don't take too long and make sure you pay on your way out. That kind of world makes certain bodies welcome, and it makes certain bodies unwelcome. And if you're even halfway interested in the news today, you know that black bodies and brown bodies in the public realm are under attack. That should be a concern in any city, but it should certainly be a concern in a city where 80% of your population is African American or Latino. We think there's no place in the city of Detroit that should make 3/4 of your population uncomfortable. It should not make 3/4 of your population feel they're unwanted, that they are not invested, especially in a place like Detroit, where we're just now getting to a point where we are reinvesting in our city. We should make that reinvestment available for everyone. So what we want to do in our process is to make sure that we are addressing communities all over the city, across people, across cultures, across income groups, across aesthetics, across abilities. But not only do we want to have those people as our collaborators, our co-creators, we also want to make sure that we are bringing along people who are no longer with us, because they have left behind us a legacy. Oh, I might keep going backwards. I went too far. Yeah, take it back. Because they have left with us a legacy. And a legacy that says we can care for each other. We should support each other. We can move forward together. We can grow together, we can challenge each other, we can educate each other. That is our responsibility. That is the responsibility of the civic realm. That's the responsibility of civic institutions like this. And we should do that by any means necessary.
We decided to not be silent, to reach into our throats for the words that shouldn't have to be said, to author our character to be caretakers of our own narrative, to craft content contrary to convoluted constructs, ensuring that our history is being told and in our own language. We can no longer apologize for fighting for the freedom in our walk, or stand still while our bodies are being moved in the direction of mischaracterization. Because it's time for the world to acknowledge that our lives have and always will matter. We decided on not being decided on without our damn permission. So call it defiance, non-compliance, kept us hellbound, demonize us, do whatever you have to do to keep us quiet. We just refuse to be miswritten, misspoken on, relied on, or indicted on misconstrued versions of the truth. So broadcast this. It's what the anchorman missed. We are limitless, plucked wings that still manage to fly, ex-mental prisoners of someone else's expectations. Our brains and our bodies were never meant to be beaten into submission to temper fearful dispositions. Our strength holds the stars in place. It takes the night to mold soldiers, and we are eternal warriors. Audacious dances, the deepest of lovers. We are your fathers, your sons, your friends, your brothers. We are your teachers, leaders, keepers of cultural secrets, possibilities, and opportunities. So we decided to speak in our honor, in our celebration, speak over history and speak out of love, to speak into existence the real of our resilience, highlight our brilliance, to come to the understanding that we are all the same children of this world we live in, and as they have not left us, we will not leave you. So, we decided to not be silent, to reach into our throats for the words that shouldn't have to be said, to author our character to be caretakers of our own narrative, to craft content contrary to convoluted constructs, ensuring that our history is being told, but in our own language. We can no longer apologize for fighting for the freedom in our walk, or stand still where our bodies are being moved in the direction of mischaracterization. Because it is time for the world to acknowledge that our lives have and always will matter. On this, we decide.
All right, my sister.
Acknowledge, you said? Empowered. Empowered. Can I get one more? Two more. Shout it out.
Included.
Included. Come through. All right. Maybe one more from Jared. Anybody?
Valued.
Valued. Ooh, I like y'all are good at this. Okay, so thank you for saying those things. Those types of emotions, that surprise, that shock that you all should have just gotten, is exactly what we want to happen in our community engagement.
All right.
One of the things that we do at Mass Design is we really challenge how the bodies perform in and around spaces. What we like to do is figure out how our bodies, our voices, can unlock a place. And in that conversation, are we able to actually get genuine dialogue and genuine input from various diverse groups of people? And so we wanted to give you all this performance aspect to explain to you that we have a creative way of approaching our community conversations. They won't simply be workshops. Rather, there will be a series of events that asks a very vast group of stakeholders to come to the table and have conversations that they otherwise might not have had. And in doing so, we get away from this whole permission denied, and we lead ourselves into a conversation about access granted.
And I think we're ready to start with the questions from the jury. I know, Salvador, you want to start with the introductions?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like to give the opportunity to the jury to introduce themselves so we can start right after the round of questions. My name is Salvador Salord, and I am the director of the DI.
Hi, I'm Rick Rogers. I'm president of the College for Creative Studies.
I'm Juanita Moore. I'm president of the Right. I saw you.
I'm Julie Bargman. I am founder of Dirt Studio. They probably can hear me. And professor of landscape architecture at University of Virginia.
Hi, I'm Maurice Cox, director of planning for the city of Detroit.
Hello, Kara McCarty, Director of Curatorial, Cooper Hewitt, Smithsonian Design Museum.
Mario Moore, visual artist born and raised in Detroit, but I live in Brooklyn.
I'm William Gilchrist, Director of Planning and Building for the City of Oakland, California.
And I'm Jonathan Massey, Dean at the A. Alfred Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the, what, University of Michigan?
I gotta believe that's an inside joke.
Regrettably, it's not inside anymore.
I guess I'll start with the question. So you talked a lot about access, right? This idea of generating access for everyone, right? And usually the images that you showed were like inside the institutions and involved the people that were already inside, right, the facility to kind of grant them an additional access. How do you generate that type of access to communities that or even the way that some of the like internet programs that you prescribe for people to present content or ideas for communities that don't have access to internet and are not inside the museum? Like, how do you go about getting to those spaces outside of access?
I can start with that, and then I'll pass it to Nathan to expand. We've been talking a lot about this. I think we all have a bit of experience with the difficulty of technology outside the elements, exposed to the elements, and have talked about a way of at least networking the institutions through smart inside installations, and ways that we could bring that outside, I think, are similar to StoryCorps or the Big Heart. There are ways of maybe using these installations, the way we're interacting with those installations, to show up in other places that might be inside, that might be outside, that might be a combination. I think that's one of the starkest contrasts, is the inside to the outside on all these institutions around the site, and how to potentially start to break that down so that there is less of a hard line. So whether there is a series of pavilions, semi-inside, outside places to host some of these platforms that might be covered from the elements, partially opened. I think there's a range of sort of gradients.
I just wanted to say one more thing. So to the inside-outside thing, I'm just thinking about the places that the type of access you're talking about were presented, like Times Square, like all these very public places that people go to. I'm talking about beyond those places that people come to, like the museum area, that can have some contribution to what's going to happen around the museum.
Yeah, it's a great question. Part of the way we think about platforms is that the tentacles, if you will, of the platform can appear in many, many different places. And we think about what the right medium is for each location. So inside the walls of an institution, that's where you might put something where people would actually go deeper on the collection. It wouldn't make sense to put something like that outside for a number of reasons. Durability and maintenance are really real concerns. But what can happen outside can be either a beacon, just so that people know that there is activity, that it actually feels like these public spaces are alive, there are people here, and anyone can come up and see that their presence actually makes a difference, that we, just by being here, we've created something that scales up your presence and the people that you bring with you. At the same time, yes, internet access is an issue, but it's becoming more and more and more universal, and we think about the technology that everyone does carry around with them. What can be the part of the platform that is right for that medium? When you think about StoryCorps, when we think about the XQ Super School, booth, those actually went out into the communities. They may have started in very prominent, very public places like the New York Public Library, and that was by design. That was where the foot traffic was. It made sense to make a splash there and to make a statement, and we want to do that here. This is part of the job, is to make a big statement about what Midtown and what this arts district is. But then, by all means, let's see what's working. Let's take it out into those communities, and then let's also bring it back.
I would like to add sort of one thing to that as well, is that, you know, all the technology in the world, all the great spaces in the world won't matter unless it's relevant to your group, to the people that you're trying to reach. And so what we try to think about very much and very deeply is, how do you make something relevant, right? Now we can't.
Can you actually give some example of how you make something relevant? Just give us a tangible example, because I think we all buy the concept, but I want to know what it looks like.
Oh, see, I knew he was going to say what it looks like.
What it feels like. I mean, we just something.
I mean,
well, let me give you this. Okay, so for example, the painting, I'm going to get the artist's name wrong, and it's going to make, I know this is going to go out on the web, and it's going to make it really bad. But the artist who did President Obama's painting, what's his name? Kundawala? Right, okay. Right, okay. So there's a painting here in the museum, right? So that is relevant on the east side of Detroit. That's relevant on the west side of Detroit. But if you don't know it's here, you're not going to come. That relevance doesn't matter, right? So getting it out into the community makes it relevant. Trying to create spaces, that's a little more difficult, because you have to talk to the people who are here. I can tell you about Chicago or some other place, but what's relevant in Detroit is specific to Detroit. But we have the skills to do that.
Thank you for that. I mean, I know we have lots. We've got 9 people on the dais, and I know that they're dying to ask you questions. So you might want to not all answer the same question. Something that I am really, I mean, I'm taken by the new tools that are very commonplace, whether it's digital platforms or whether it's use of spoken word for engagement. I want to know, do you think that there's a physical space aspect of this, whether there's a formal structure that needs to be corrected? As designers, not just of platforms and processes, but of physical places, what can we or should we expect from you?
I think the fundamental thing is changing in a big way the identity of the landscape. When you step into the district, what does that look like and feel like? Well, we've talked about, does it make sense to keep calling it a district and a campus? These sort of words that connote pathways and lawns and trees, but have no formal identity. And is it a park? Is it a garden? Is it a sort of stormwater infrastructure network with stages throughout for various permanent art fixtures or temporary performance spaces, or is it all about programming? I think it's a combination of those things. Smart programming that works across the institutions and draws from multiple overlaps that are already happening. But the physical infrastructure of that, I think, needs to be a range of things. And I think it can be concentrated around the DIA grounds and more potential for perhaps these grounds to expand, as some of our diagrams showed, and that we create a massive transformation in the planted character in the physical spaces that are here, that you can be walking through this forest that Jessica sort of suggested, that is filled with different kinds of seating, be it things hanging from the trees or things that can be moved around that people can own and change, that there's stormwater, systems and functions beneath that, and that the relationship between those new insertions and the power of the institutions and the programming already happening start to really create this new identity, this new potential for the landscape to come alive, for people to explore here, find something new here. I think we see it as big, bold, large-scale landscape moves, big stormwater taking over the whole street, big forests, big, pieces of topography, really inverting that power dynamic between the public and the ground they're activating and accessing, and the large scale of many of these buildings in this physical space. Those need to come into alignment and be better balanced.
So if I may, I'd like to pull the thread on that a bit. And I thought it was a wonderful presentation, very moved by the early projects you showed. And one of my first projects was the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, where I also worked with late Max Bond, who was the museum director for the 9/11. And it was interesting to see you all open with that project portfolio in terms of the focus thematically that it brings on historic events and reflection. And this is a different kind of space. I'm sure you can cull some of that kind of feeling here as well if you look at this through a historical lens of the city of Detroit, how the space was formed, the history of the institutions. But just given the broad civic purpose of a space like this, and you were starting to get into it with your response, that we have this multiple portfolio of institutional footprint, this kind of archipelago of culture here. What do you, or do you approach any particular attitude about how you might nuance or inflect or program these spaces as their proximity to these various institutions varies? As you move from one space to the next, is there something that is distinctive, given all the space you have, that you see your landscape reflecting or capturing, as opposed to being one large statement with its own internal vocabulary? What happens as we move through this? What's curated, what's explained, what's the adventure, what's the experience?
It's a wonderful question. We have this is why we love thinking about this project, because there's so much potential, and the precision to how these landscape features adapt and change, I think they have to. I think that you have to be able to know when you're by the right museum, when you're by the Science Center, and that the pieces of the landscape that are going to express that and draw that out need to respond. So if it is more about stormwater infrastructure being tied to the Science Center, and that the overlap between that, I think we've written and drawn and talked about potential for sort of history education sessions in that kind of landscape, that you can be dropping off a school group or your kids to be going to the Science Museum, and you pass through an event that's being programmed by the right museum. That there's sort of intersectionality happening, that the landscape provides for that. So it's giving identity perhaps more to one institution, but it's directly in the way of access to another institution, that we can kind of very deliberately create overlaps and cross-exposure in that experience. So as it is now, I think Craig also says, you go to DIA, you leave DIA. You go to the right museum, you leave the right museum. You rarely go from one to the next. The landscape can help change that. It can help, as you're approaching one institution, you are experiencing fundamentally an awesome program or physical sort of expression of another institution. I don't know that maybe gives you the kind of visual connotation you were looking for, but
thinking about the landscape in terms of several moods. That someday you might, I'm sorry, speaking about the landscape in terms of moods, some days you might want to be contemplative. So there's a space for that. Maybe you're sitting by the water that's running, or maybe you're sitting down in a bowl. Or someday you might want to be engaged in some very, perhaps difficult conversations, or just nice conversations, right? So you want to be someplace where you can actually see people right across. So you're thinking about terms of moods, like, I can come here when I feel anything, because there's always something for me.
I think that that attention to experience is maybe one of the things that was striking across the different members of this team, both in your presentation style and in your different projects, whether it's fog or deaf space and sensory rooms, or the Red Heart in Times Square, and I could imagine a kind of Detroit space dimension to whatever you did here.
Yes, just maybe I could develop that a little bit because two things. First of all, I got very excited by your presentation and a lot of your ideas. It's very ambitious, and many of them could come with a hefty price tag. So I'm just wondering, once you get into the project, how would you start to prioritize what you might do if you have to scale back? How would you prioritize and decide what to do first?
Sure. And I apologize, I failed to mention two of our key collaborators on that slide in the beginning, Candace Damon from HRNA Advisors and Ben Shepard from Atelier 10. So we would lean heavily on our partners at HRNA to help us be strategic about our approach to programming, our approach to even phasing and sequencing, and what installations might have, or pieces, features, have the ability to capture sort of development and financial revenue generation potential.
And I would also like to add to that we would, again, use the feedback that we're getting from the community to help us to prioritize the things that we want to do. So being able to cast a wide enough net to get ample feedback to understand from Detroit as a whole, what do you need this landscape to do? What do you need these programs to do? How do you need us to help you to stitch together these institutions in a way that will impact you and invite you, for decades to come, that will also assist us in how we prioritize the things we do.
Add one more thing. In speaking with HRNA, in the beginning part of the process was this idea of a partnerships approach and being really strategic about kind of a collaboration across institutions that might be a slightly different model in terms of how it's maintained and operated. What does that look like? There's a lot of different sort of examples we can draw from across cities for participating in the funding and maintenance of shared public ground. And they're extremely strategic about helping the institutions to navigate that kind of complex and messy process.
Thank you. And I have another question, and it gets a little bit to what Craig was alluding to, but I worked in a museum my entire career, and the discussion that's happening in a lot of museums, institutions today is how do we engage the public? How do we change maybe programmatically what we're doing, how we give the information, how we tell the story. And so help me understand how you might do that to work with the different stakeholders, the institutions here.
Do you want to talk through the events that we were thinking about?
So one way that we might, nope, is it here? Okay, that's fine. Don't worry about it. I can paint you a picture very well. So we were, as I was mentioning before, we were planning to do a series of events initially in order to help to start the conversation. And we want those events to be at different scales and in different places. And so some of those will be indoors, some of those will be outdoors, some of those will include performance art and food trucks and et cetera. Some of those will be youth oriented. Some of those will be led conversations by the community. Others will be from the institutions turning inside out. And essentially what we would want to be able to do is to say to all of the stakeholders, everybody has a part in this conversation. So rather than saying, we came to the institutions and we said, how do you plan to get more people into the doors and how do you plan to bring the public in, we would say to the public, what would make you walk into these doors? And how do we have programs and events and the sharing of this information to get you in? So for example, we were looking at the website yesterday, the DIA website, and we were noticing all of the events that happen both here and out in the communities. And we were saying, this is great if you know to come to your website. And mostly tourists do those types of things. They're in Detroit and they say, well, what should I do in Detroit? And they go to the website and they find out. But if I'm from Detroit and I live here, I'm not gonna necessarily think to check the website. And so we would create events and have conversations that help us to better understand where would you look to find this information? Or where would you like to see this information show up so that you don't actually have to go and find it? Those are some of the ways that we'd have these community events to figure out some of the best ways to get the community in the doors, if that makes sense.
We also talked a lot, well, I mean not a lot, but we also talked about the idea of community curatorial work. Like that, maybe there's a night, a movie night that's hosted by a community organization or a school, and they are the ones who program it, they announce it, they bring people in, they feel like they're part of the museum. Maybe, you know, some of the spaces that end up getting designed are available for community use, that they also get to program it, they get to curate it, to become part of the museum thinking, so that they know, well, if I didn't go into the museum, I still might be able to curate something outside the museum, and maybe that will get me into the museum. At least it shows that the institutions are reaching out, trying to think differently about what is relevant to their constituents.
Rick, you want to take one more, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
I'm impressed by what you said about community engagement, given a pretty powerful model for that. One thing you really haven't spoken about is engaging the institutions themselves. You know, there were 12 institutions. I think 3 of them are represented on this jury, and you know, we all are neighbors. We all are neighbors, and we get along with one another, but we don't do a lot of collaboration right now, and we have very different, to some extent, different missions, different needs, different challenges, and we have large populations that work within the museums. And so, you know, and then there are also other entities, you know, that are part of this district, like, you know, residential housing, and there are, you know, people who will be affected by this plan. So it's a very big and complicated project, and I would really like to hear more about how you would propose to approach those complexities.
One of the events that we feel is extremely important is beginning to what needs to be much longer than a 4-month competition phase, a series of conversations between executive directors, curators, the people developing programming of each of the institutions. Understanding how each institution is marketing and advertising their events. I think there's some already between Wright and Michigan Science Center that are kind of collaborating on a couple programming pieces already. So understanding what collaborations are already existing, what are not at all, where the potential is for kind of documenting and sussing that all out. And we probably, in that mid-October session where we're back in Detroit, would dedicate one event to start, to facilitate a conversation between all these sort of key people from the institutions to begin that dialogue. I think we'll have to work together really carefully to figure out what is feasible for that conversation starter within this 3-month, 4-month constrained time frame, and how to really set the framework for that to be meaningful.
Well, there's probably, maybe a little more collaboration going on than people know about or think about. But the one thing that I want to go back to is people in the neighborhood, in the communities, because there are maybe the people that are moving into the neighborhoods are people that come more often, but the people that's been here for a while, I would encourage you not to overlook those people and all around, because they are the ones I think that probably do not come and have not for years. So really getting them, because they're right here and they're the closest. And so thinking about people that's been here for a while in these neighborhoods, that's the seniors. And we start talking about access and walkability, and there are a number of senior centers right around here. And people, may feel like it's not, where would they sit when they walk over here? I ran into a woman yesterday, and she said, I met her right, and she said, I want to get my membership, but I'm tired. I can't walk anymore. And she had, had been here and seen Mario's grandmother in the museum and was really excited about it. And she said, I brought my checkbook with me, but there's no place for her to sit between walking from here to the right and just rest. So I think we need to think about those kinds of things.
Yeah, if I may, that's an excellent point. I just want to chime in on it very quickly. And you made the point very well, sir, about having a range of physical experiences in the space. And just thinking about a place for our citizens that is beautiful, that accommodates the range of experiences they want to live in, just as a destination in itself. They may not want to enter any of the institutions, but it'd be great to make a place of beauty for them, just for that purpose, just as the doctor was describing.
And we're going to open it up now to the audience for questions. Please step up to the mics, which are a little bit more forward. Go ahead. Yep, make sure it's...
Hello. Hello. I'm a resident of the area, and I guess my question would be, do you view this more as a project to get people to go to the institutions, or more to enliven the grounds of the institutions? And also, do you view doing enlivening the grounds or getting people to go to the institutions more as something that is evergreen, design changes that will make it just organically more attractive to people, or is it something more about planning and highly programming the landscape so that people will want to visit that programming?
I hate the both and answer, but it really does need to be both and. I mean, it's a planning exercise. The scale demands it to be so. But it's also resolving at a micro level the kinds of spaces that people want to come to, both that are visiting as tourists as well as people who live here. You know, where is that individual space of solitude where you as a resident might go to read or have a picnic with your family, or for Joel and Liz who come here to play with their kids. That the furniture and that the spaces are playful for all ages, accessible for all ages. You know, that there is, you know, different types of seat. I mean, there's so much potential. I think it's both and would be my answer, which maybe is a cop-out, but.
We have another question here.
So I live in the area, and I work in the area, and I bike in the area. And I do notice there's probably 6 senior citizen residential spaces around here. And it's interesting that they don't all, you know, well, we all know that they don't all walk like you and I. So a lot of them may have walkers or wheelchairs too. So I just want to know, and I'm also thinking about like the digital platform as well. I don't feel like they're going to interact in that way, and even though this is a university cultural district, this is also a senior district. I feel like my sister was raised over here by her maternal grandmother, who lived in the building for as long as, I think Kim was 30 by the time her grandmother died in her 90s. And she was a volunteer at the Charles H. Wright Museum. Actually, you all had to ask her not to volunteer. She was like 100 and volunteering. And so not everybody was as mobile as Nina was, Nina Dowdell. But I just want that to be considered, you know, that the seniors that live here, you don't often see them because there's nowhere for them to kind of convene. So I'm hoping that's a part of your discussion. Even in the university district that we're in, they're here. We may not see them, because I didn't see them in many of the pictures. And I did see Grace Lee Boggs and Jimmy Boggs, but I mean, you know, they're here. And so I just want that to be a consideration in the ideas that you have.
Absolutely, thank you. I think that's an excellent point.
Are there any more questions?
I mean, I can speak to that a little bit more.
Okay.
A successful public realm that we're talking about here has layers of experience. And we thought of some of those, and all of you have brought more layers to the table that we have to think about. And we see all of that as potential energy. When I look around, what I see are assets. I see architecture that's an asset. I see stories that are an asset. I see collections that are an asset. I see people that are an asset. And we don't believe that all people will use all of these experiences the same way. but we all know what a thriving public space looks like. All kinds of people doing all kinds of things. And so our next task is to figure out how to map those and to think about these users. And we think about the institutions as users too. So as designers, our job is to make sure that we fulfill and provide something for everyone who is going to be using this space. And that means for the institutions as well.
And I just would add too that you're not the first person that's brought that up directly to us. In the interviews that you saw earlier, a gentleman named Roland, he seemed like a very lively fellow, but he told us he was a senior citizen and he comes to the DIA to meditate. And so for him, he makes this personal connection in a super peaceful way on the grounds. And so we're very aware of that and we're excited by those possibilities. And then as well, Joel and I, living in the Park Shelton for 10 years, that was not a designated senior housing at all by any means, but it was a wonderful place for senior citizens to live and have access to this cultural center with ease. And a number of our good friends and neighbors would definitely call themselves senior citizens and ask for those same things. And I mean, we even have interviews that we conducted with them that just didn't even make it today into those clips. So absolutely.
Kelvin? Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. You included parking as part of your permission denied scenario that you painted for the area. Speaking for the DIA specifically, our visitors tell us, and they tell us loudly and frequently, that parking is an issue, and that's largely driven by the lack of a regional transportation that would allow people to get to this walkable, more accessible space that we're trying to get to. In your experience, given that may be specific to this project, how do you balance the need for access with the need for parking? Because parking for us right now at the DIA is creating an access denied situation.
Parking is always an issue in these sorts of kind of collective districts. I think we would look at structured parking, underground parking. These also have a cost associated with it. How many institutions need to draw from those places where they need to be located to better serve multiple institutions at the same time. And where structures could go is also where retail or other development pieces could go. So there's relationships between development opportunities and structured parking to work hand in hand and minimize their footprint, as well as activate and provide additional assets and give us more ground to do some of the stuff we're talking about. So I think that's something we would need to dive into and focus on with all the institutions.
I want to hold here because we have 10 minutes to either finish up or continue with questions. It's up to you guys. It's your time.
Well, let me just say one thing. One of the things that we're also really interested in, so I know the SIA parking might have come up, but the idea that these, in the meantime, before there's parking in garages, these surfaces can be thought of as maybe more multi-programmed or multi-use. So there could be, integrated planting, so it's not just a sea of asphalt. And then maybe on weekends it could be transformed into some other event, or it could be tied with something larger, a larger city initiative to maybe everyone goes out and bikes that day, and then the parking lot's closed down, and there's some imagination or some envisioning of what this surface could be and get people excited and think of alternate means of transportation. So we know it's a very, landscape architects, we encounter parking requirements and the need for parking and transportation all the time, but there are ways to kind of imagine what else this could be without completely removing it on day one and then get people to buy in and be excited.
Do you want to take this question, but that's going to cut into your time? That's okay? Okay.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Leslie, and I'm working currently at the Charles H. Wright Museum with the Michigan Science Center. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you are going to capture all of your input from all of these different sessions, and how you might share that back with future people who might need to access sort of your logic models on what sort of cross-cutting concepts you're going to be developing. And also if you could talk a little bit about how you're going to set aside time to do the deep thinking with all the sort of institutions in the area.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think designing this process is the next series of questions. You know, if we move on with all of you, a big piece of the next conversation is what is it that your North Star is? What is it that you want? And how do we develop and design those conversations around achieving as much as possible in this next series of months? So a big piece of that is conversation. We talked about events, we talked about engagement, we talked about designs of physical space, but ultimately it's about the kind of stories we want to tell, the kind of vision that we want to have, the kind of collective and disparate ideas that we're bringing together around the right table. So I would say designing the conversation, designing the table, designing that process is really the kind of next series of steps that we would do. And we hope that we showed to you today a series of examples of how we've done that in different but also successful ways.
So I think 6 minutes to close. Is that good?
Can you just go to the common good? That one before, yeah. So just to summarize, this idea of the civic commons as a place to remember and dream, and a place to reclaim our human values, where we're inspired to be a better person, we celebrate our collective aspirations, and provide for ourselves and each other. I hope we've illustrated some of the initial ideas that we are thinking about, but we acknowledge that we've been working in a bubble, and while we have awesome local collaborators and we've spent time here over the last 2 days, there is a lot more that needs to be done to build on this. I think we've started a conversation that we very much want to continue with all of you. And I can't say thank you enough for the opportunity to be able to have those conversations and the potential to be able to think about some of these challenges.
I just want to echo that gratitude for the privilege to be here, to be able to talk with you all. I think one of the fundamental challenges of this project is that you have these incredibly strong institutions with their own missions, with their own identifiable missions, which are not the same mission. And so one of the things that we really need to do collectively is this district needs a mission. This district needs a shared idea. And that is not evident through the brief. It's part of this process, and it's what we need to do together. And when I talk about, and this is what we do in every project, I want to get back to a point that Kara had brought up, which is finding the mission is exactly the design process that we need to unlock the potential of what this place could be. And unlocking potential does two things. It unlocks the possibility of access, which is this process of empowerment, but it also unlocks capital. If we find the right mission, that North Star that we all can agree on is where we want to be, it unlocks new sources of actual financial capital. We've seen this happen. The project in Montgomery that we showed, the soil collection was one of the processes that we designed to build consensus, but also unlock new narrative. It cost us $10,000. It involved no digital technology. It just involved 365 names and 365 jars, and all we needed to do was have communities collect soil and share those stories and bring it back to a place. It created incredible awareness, and that allowed us to unlock over $20 million in funding for that project, among other things. But we had no money, we had no site, we just had a vision at the beginning, and it unlocked all of that fundraising. So I want to say shared vision and North Star can unlock the potential, and that process is one of empowerment. It is the second point, which is if we do that collectively and well, we create dignity, we construct dignity. And the construction of dignity is ultimately what this project needs to do, because it deals with this third piece, which is, I think,
the institution's role here in Detroit is about our civic identity, our civic polis. And that is, I think, especially here in the city of Detroit, reflects back on the challenge in the United States of how our institutions are being increasingly privatized, back to what Craig is talking about, which is that we have to fight against that, and how much of that narrative is being held here is also part of our opportunity to do this well. And ultimately, it goes to my final point, which we heard from the audience and from the jury, which is that the ultimate goal, I think this goes to Mario's point, which is, will we do something? Is there a physical space? Well, yes, there has to be a physical intervention. It can't just be something digital or in, let's say, in the cloud or online, because without the physical space, without more than just an event, we aren't able to see something that inspires us and symbolizes beauty. And beauty is ultimately the transfer of justice. This is our fundamental and foundational opinion. We as designers create beauty, and it's not just something aesthetic that we like to look at. Beauty is created if we create more justice. So this is the goal here. This is how we would advance our series of conversations and how we'd hope to partner with all of you, and we're deeply grateful for this time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, 10 by 10.